So hello and welcome to this demo video of the Endorphin.es Furthrrrr Generator. Let's check out what's to come before we get into it. Now here's the Furthrrrr Generator in its new lovely lush black panel. You can just see the grand terminal to the right of the screen there, the nice gold colourful panels that Endorphins have always used. And right at the start of the video, I should say that for this right hand carrier main oscillator section, I am using the strong digital through-zero linear FM core. This is an alternative chip that you can get for the Furthrrrr Generator, and you simply just swap these out on the back of the module, really simple. I won't be using the original analog core. This will be analog all the way through. This will be the new digital strong zero core, giving us this great lush linear through-zero FM on this modulation bus. Now the Furthrrrr Generator, like other complex oscillators, shares its heritage in the Buchla 259, where we have a modulation oscillator, a carrier oscillator, the kind of main one that you listen to and want to modulate it with, a great wave shaping section, a mood bus, sometimes called a mod bus, or the kind of modulation section between the two oscillators. And it's got a few other nice little tricks up its sleeve as well. We get balanced modulation between the two sides, amplitude modulation, frequency modulation, and further modulation, this wave shaping. So let's plug it in and go through the features with some sounds at the same time. Now the tuning is on these large pots. They're 10-turn pots that are super easy to fine tune. For example, if I take, say, the final output, and I've got some FM going on, it's really easy to find those stable points. Almost sounds like they're in sync. It's kind of that easy to tune. So the tuning is on these 10-turn pots. They have a great lovely kind of zip sound to them as well. I really like that. Modulation oscillator has a sine, saw, and square wave. We have inputs for soft and hard sync for this oscillator, and we can take it down into LFO ranges with an LED that then shows us the range and rate of that LFO. We also get a selection for the mood wave, and this modulation bus between the two oscillators is the mood section. We have a mood index that controls the depth of modulation, and we can choose which wave feeds that to it. So if we just listen to, say, the final out, tune up some FM, and then change the wave, it's really easy just to reroute waves into that modulation section. Now the noise is a red LED rather than green, and that's to show us that this can be the external input. which is right there. So you can actually put an external input into that, and later on in the video I put the black noir in and do some nice ring modulation, quite crazy wave shaping with drums against the oscillator through the mod bus. We get a key input for Vault Proctive on the oscillator, an FM which is actually pre-wired for cross mod, so let me show you that quickly. Here's this FM again. Now as I turn up the FM here, the output pre-routes for cross modulation. Great for instability. And you can just patch anything in there. We also get an attenuated CV input as well. Now the right hand oscillator again has a sine, saw, square, and the square on this side, PWMs, pulse width modulators dependent on the wave shaping. That's really lovely at audio rates, and we'll explore that later in the video. We also get two of these final outputs, which are the ones affected by this modulation bus. Now FM, because it's frequency modulating the core of the oscillator, will affect every output. However, things like the amplitude modulation don't affect those final outs. We have the wave shaping section giving us folding, harmonic control, and the way that the wave shaping section works, there's some nice graphics in the manual that explain that. And as always, read the manual. Endorphins make nicely animated manuals as well. There's some overlays on screen for that wave shaping. Like the other oscillator, we have a Vault Proctive input, FM in and CV in with attenuator, great for patching in, say, vibrato and things like that. Now the wave shaping section, we get CV over the controls, one of which has an attenuator. We can soft or hard sync two other signals. We can actually lock the sync in with a switch on this one as well, which is nice. And let's just explore this modulation bus quickly before we get into some patches. So final output, low pitch sine to start with, balanced modulation, which is ring mod, and coupling this mood bus with, say, additional wave shaping, is really where the further generator starts to come to life. Amplitude modulation, which is AM. Slightly different to ring mod, we'll look at the differences later in the video. The through zero linear FM. Again, start wave shaping this. And things get pretty crazy. And also audio rate modulation of the further of the wave shaping section. Just tune up a little bit. So there's just a ton of control and tonal possibilities. Again, this video is all with this strong digital linear through zero FM core. Let's get into some patches. So let's take a look at some of the wave shaping possibilities. And we're going to start with simple wave folding. Now I have some modulation into the symmetry. Let's remove that for now. We're also going to use the oscillator to modulate the folding at audio rate. And there's a whole range of really great tones that come out of this thing. But let's start nice and simple and just turn up the wave folding depth with the top right symmetry control. Nice range to the folder. This is where the fun starts. The modulation oscillator on the left modulating the fold amount. The further switch, as it were. And it's absolutely killer. And as you just heard, there's a lot of other wave shaping to be had as well. With the symmetry, the odd and even controls, and the further knob, there's a lot of wave shaping to be had from this input sine wave. So here we're just going to quickly take a look at the difference between balanced modulation, i.e. ring modulation, and amplitude modulation for AM synthesis. And I really love AM synthesis, and we're going to explore that in further patches in this video. You may think that ring modulation and AM are the same. I've had comments saying exactly that, you know, AM synthesis equals ring modulation. Well, not quite. AM synthesis and VCAs in general tend to work in a unipolar fashion, in that they take a voltage of, say, 0, your bass level, and they will amplify positively, but they won't go through 0 into the negative domain, like a bipolar VCA or a ring modulator. And to demonstrate that quickly, here's a sine from this right-hand oscillator, and we're going to look at amplitude and balanced modulation. I've got a nice interval already tuned up on the left-hand oscillator. Let's check out AM first, and turn up the depth of modulation. Now notice on the scope, it still retains its wave shape. The positive section of the sine wave, the carrier sine wave, doesn't flip down negatively, and the negative portions don't flip up positively. This is AM synthesis. Amplitude modulation. Now with balanced modulation, it can go through 0 and modulate both positive and negative gain over this carrier. So look and listen and see how it's different. So that pretty much looks like AM, but when I turn the depth up even further, there's our ring modulation, and I'll flick between the two. Ring mod, AM, balanced modulation, and amplitude. So I was getting set up for another patch, but I just simply put an envelope into the mood bus, the mod bus, with the FM turned on, so the modulator FMs the carrier, the left-hand oscillator frequency modulating the right-hand side with that strong linear FM digital core. And this kind of gong bell-like sound came out, which is what we're listening to. The two kind of main outs, one is going to the scope to give us some eye candy, the other one is going to the mixer to be recorded. But with that really nice stable FM modulation, it's just given us this great tone, and I had to stop and just film this rather than carry on with the patch that I intended to set up. I mean, listen to it. It's got this doomy kind of church bell over a graveyard drone vibe. So I was going to pull down the previous patch, and then I figured let's get some more grand terminal modulation thrown in there. It's kind of dissonant and weird, but it's got a little groove to it. So here I've turned the Furthrrrr Generator into a 4-part drum machine. Let's just listen for a second. Got a kick, a snare or clap, hi-hats, and a little affected wobbly thing. Now I'll remove the parts one by one and we'll go through how they were made. Now the kick is the sine wave output from the right hand oscillator into a VCA with an envelope controlling the amplitude. There's another envelope coming into the CV input, which takes it from this sub-flabby low pitch up to giving us a nice kick. Super simple. And even simpler, the noise output goes into a VCA with an envelope and that gives us a clap. The hi-hats are the square output from the modulation oscillator, but I have some cross modulation turned up. I'm also taking the noise output to the 1 volt per octave input, and I'm just going to open up the envelope a little bit more on the VCA, controlling this sound. There's the sound with the cross mod from the other oscillator, but that noise into the volt per octave gives us nice noisy tones, perfect for some hi-hats. And there's 2 different rhythms opening the VCA, giving us this kind of layered hi-hat percussion kind of sound. The 4th sound is the main output. I'm modulating the mod index, so this hi-hat sound is what's coming across to modulate the carrier. I'm also modulating the depth of that modulation, going into the grand terminal, using an envelope to open and close the low pass gate on board, and into some reverb. Now all together, we have an interesting little drum kit. So here we have a patch from the Patch and Tweak book. Now this features endorphins and a patch directly from them. It also features this rather dashing young man as well. And I'll link Patch and Tweak the book in the description if you haven't checked it out. It's a fantastic book, hardware reading material, if you will. Now this Endorphins patch is based on using both sides of the Furthrrrr generator as individual voices that we let sum together in a mixer, but we can also get some interesting interactions between them. Here's the left-hand oscillator, and it suggests that this is 2 octaves below the right-hand voice or the upper voice in terms of this patch diagram on screen, and that I use a saw or a square wave through a low-pass gate with an envelope controlling it into a mixer. But the first thing to do was actually get these in tune with each other. So let's pull the sequences. We can see there on the Modx data that has a tuner, this is tuned to B1, just taking the sine out into the data for the tuner, and this one is set to B3. You can see the note there on screen. So these are 2 octaves apart from each other. If I bring in the other sound, now the upper part suggests using a sine wave, which is the final output through some shaping, again this final output stage of the Furthrrrr generator, through a low pass gate or filter, separate sequence, into some effects and into the mixer. So here's a different sequence, a little bit of a dodgy cable somewhere. Let's add some reverb as well as the reverse delay. So 2 different sequences. These are all quantized to the same scale. The notes in this case on my quantizer are C, E flat, F, G and A flat. We can hear they're all in tune with each other. Now the interesting part and the suggestion in the patch diagram is that we actually use the through zero linear FM on this strong digital core to modulate the higher melody with the bass line. Now they're not going to be exact nice tuned ratios for the FM, but they are in the same key, so we get some interesting overtones. Let's turn up the FM. Just a little bit to distort and wave shape this sine sounds really nice and musical, but yet somehow raspy and edgy at the same time. Of course the wave shaping works really well. So So here the Furthrrrr Generator is just giving us this big, rich drone sound with lots of internal modulation and some patched modulation as well that I'll go through. And I'm running the sound out into the grand terminal for some filtering, but it's fully open, so it's effectively not really there if you like. But here's the filter sound. And some reverb. Kind of cancelling out the grand terminal for now. If you want to see more of the grand terminal, go watch that video linked in the description. But here's all the internal routing on the Furthrrrr Generator. Now I've routed the noise from this oscillator back into itself for frequency modulation. Just really thick, kind of like mad overloading distortion kind of vibe from it. I've routed the sine out back round to modulate the left hand oscillator. And that was just turning this oscillator into a low frequency range, turning it into an LFO effectively. I'm modulating the amount of wave shaping as well. I'm modulating the depth of the mod bus. Now filtering that back, adding some reverb. So here's a nice plucky sound through an external low-pass gate. The Furthrrrr Generator is being modulated by the grand terminal next to it, and we're modulating the mod bus by hand. And we'll flick between the different Furthrrrr, AM, FM options and the balanced modulation as well, and play around with some of the harmonic balancing, and maybe some sync as well. So here's the sound opening up the low-pass gate fully and losing the kick that's in the background. Let's just have a quick play around. So just with this simple sequence, the same pitch sequence into both oscillators and some basic modulation thrown in, there's a ton of tones. Now let's bring the kick back in and a little bit of fuzzy PT delay. So here we're going to take a look at pulse waves and square waves. And the actual pulse width of this square wave output is controlled by the symmetry control. So we do get PWM coupled in with what's usually the wave folding or harmonic control within the wave shaper section for the final output. So of course, modulating this with an LFO gives us some great PWM, and we can take that modulation oscillator down into the low range to create an LFO. filter. With a nice rich PWM sound. Now, one of my favourite things to do is audio rate pulse width on any oscillator, and it sounds great on the Furthrrrr Generator, so let's do just that. I'm going to take the Modulation oscillator up into audio range and just tune it in to some nice intervals for audio rate modulation. And again, I'll open up the filter so you can hear the oscillator droning in its more raw state. We get a really great biting waveform. Let's tune it into some different intervals. Now modulating the modulation, so modulating that left hand modulation oscillator so that we get different audio rate PWMs, it sounds great as well. So in this patch, we're going to look at using the modulation oscillator in its low range as an LFO, both for tremolo-like effects through the amplitude modulation and vibrato with frequency modulation. And let's start with tremolo. Now, most guitar players, I would say, are familiar with tremolo. It fades your volume up and down with an LFO, creating this rhythmic pulsing. So we can see I'm in the low range. The LED shows us the LFO's rate. I'm going to use the sine wave as the mood wave for this mood modulation bus. Flick in amplitude modulation and turn up the depth. So you can hear I sound fading in and out, and my output is the main output from the Furthrrrr Generator into a VCA, into some delay. Now backing the depth off a little bit. Even just unsynced amplitude modulation can lead to some really nice movement within the sound. So that's how we create a simple tremolo. Now, if we choose to frequency modulate this instead, we'll get vibrato, where the pitch will wobble up and down with this LFO. And the results I like best have been going straight into the CV input right on the oscillator. So let's get rid of the amplitude modulation and patch the sine wave across to FM modulate the right hand oscillator. And have just a tiny bit of depth on that attenuator. Now slower modulations I very much kind of feel wobbly with long sounds. Let's turn this up. Kind of drunk movement in and out there. We're taking this up to a faster rate again. Now here's a simple patch using the Furthrrrr Generator as a simple dual oscillator in a subtractive sense, rather than the kind of complex oscillator styling that the module's kind of built upon. So I have two waves being mixed. Let's pull this out for a second. Both saw waves going into a mixer. That's coming into the scope just to bounce around for some little green lines of eye candy on the oscilloscope. Going into the grand terminal for some nice filtering. And a touch of effects. Super simple, 2 great tracking oscillators, nice rich saw waves, very basic subtractive synthesis. But the little kind of bonus trick that I wanted to do here was to take an accent pattern and just tune that with the CV depth to adjust the tuning of one of the oscillators. So here we're taking the accent into the CV amount. And if I open this wide open, you can hear they're not tracking exactly the same sequence. The volt per octaves are still the same, but this CV in is giving us little chordal intervals because I've to some degree fine-tuned that CV depth. Now it's not totally fine-tuned because we're getting some nice detuned beating. That kind of that instability, but I really like that, and it works really nicely when the filter's down. So here we're going to explore AM synthesis, but of course being the Furthrrrr generator, we can push it further with some additional shaping, and that's where this patch has really come to life. Now this is the final output through a VCA. Nice simple sequence, and this side is entirely static. I was playing around with sequencing it from somewhere else, but I'm quite happy with a static AM source against the moving right-hand oscillator. So turning up the AM modulation, I've turned amplitude on and turning up the mood index or the mood bus. This actually being static gives us some interesting changes in the overtones that it creates. So the first thing was to add an envelope to the mod index, the AM synthesis depth or amount. Creates some more dynamic modulation. Now just a little bit of folding really brings it to life. Just a little bit of further modulation. It's really where this module shines. So here's some stepped modulation into the further wave shaping. So here's effectively the same patch as before, but I just wanted to push this AM synthesis a little bit more. I'm modulating the wave folder instead of the further. Quite similar in this instance. AM synthesis again. Different sequence to the carrier oscillator, the one that we're monitoring, the final output. Obviously much faster. Let's get rid of the effects for now. Different sequence this time to the modulating oscillator. Again, we could have that static. Lots of interesting and quite musical at times, quite clangorous at times in terms of their overtones. Envelope to the modulation depth. And this time we're going to check out the different wave shapes. Now we can obviously patch anything anywhere, but the waveform that comes in to modulate the modulation bus for the carrier is selected by the button on top of the module. So that's using a saw to amplitude modulate the carrier instead of a sine, noise or random, or a pulse. And I really like that pulse. Let's add a little bit of folding with some stepped modulation. So in this patch we're going to check out some sync sounds. Now I have an envelope moving the pitch of the right hand oscillator, which is synced to the left hand one. And by modulating the pitch of this one with the envelope, we get some interesting sync modulations. The sound is coming out of the saw wave, into the grand terminal in low pass gate mode with a little bit of reverb, because why not? So even without any modulation, we can get some interesting sync effects. Now I have my pitch going to this oscillator because that's the one that's tuned a little bit lower and is re-syncing the one on the right. Now of course, tuning these a bit more perfectly will get some more harmonious sync, but for now I just want to get some modulation in there. And it's just an envelope. Let's hear that against the sync. Couple the sync with, say, the FM. And there's again some really interesting tones to be had. And I think I've said it a few times in this video now, this is really the beauty of the Furthrrrr Generator for me, is the ability to have the mod bus, syncing, external wave shaping, plenty of control all at the same time. Now here's a relatively simple patch in its current state that you're listening to. An envelope to the Furthrrrr wave shaping, and a sequence to the right hand oscillator. What we're going to explore here is this external input on the modulation oscillator, and this goes to this red LED, which is, if we remove this, noise by default. And that external input is what feeds the mood bus, this modulation bus right in the center there. So we can inject other signals into this rather than the oscillator itself. Now, the other waves are great for amplitude and frequency modulation and so on, but here's the black noir into it. So we're ring modulating this sequenced oscillator against black noir. Let's try frequency modulation. I mean, it's harsh and heavy and obviously really quite aggressive, with some filtering and some envelope following of, say, the drum beats going into filters, VCAs, into the grand terminal. Could be an interesting sound design tool. Let's remove this modulation and try the wave shaping. It's an interesting way to merge a riff and the drums. So in this patch we're going to build up a nice musical chordal drone, which would be great to pass on to other modules and a bigger patch, but I've kept it relatively simple to show off the tone of the Furthrrrr Generator and the usefulness of the grand terminal for its effects and filtering. So the patch started by tuning the carrier, the right hand oscillator, to C2, and the modulator, the left hand oscillator, to E3. So it's a major third up an octave, quite a wide interval rather than a closed interval with the notes right next to each other. Now those on their own, and turning off the effects, sound like this. That's the saw wave C2, and the other oscillator E3, again a saw wave. And of course, animating those filters separately would give us some nice kind of dual layer with the different tunings from those different oscillators. Now running these through the effects section, gives us plenty to play with, but I've also taken the main output, which is this sound, and we're going to animate this with the wave shaping just by hand, either from the mod bus or the right hand shaper section. And because they're tuned to a chord tone, we get quite musical ring modulation. Amplitude modulation's a bit more aggressive. interesting FM tones, and of course the further pushing this wave shaping. Sounds interesting too. So I'm just quickly going to play around with some manual shaping. The final output is direct into my mixer. The mono out of the grand terminal taking those saw waves is direct to my mixer too. And it's just a nice simple patch to show that you can mix both oscillators separately, have them do one thing, also have them modulate each other and have the final output do something else to create layers and movement within a drone or a patch. So to finish on, I just wanted to create a nice random patch. Random as in truly driven by random. Have the octo controller giving us one random gate, which is what's clocking the envelopes and triggering the envelopes on the grand terminal, and also moving an external sequencer. Then I've got 7 stepped random CVs to the rise and fall time on the envelopes on the grand terminal, to the through zero, linear FM and AM, to the wave folding, the shaping, the further wave shaping. I've got the sequence coming back in, same sequence to both sides. You can play around with sync. So random tonal changes, random envelope time and amplitude changes, randomly clocking through the steps on the sequencer. But it's maybe a little bit more musical than you would expect. The quantized sequence gives it somewhat of a musical framework. I've also got a stepped random signal to the length of this verb, which is a great like frozen feedback spring kind of sound. I've had a lot of fun just playing with the further generator for this video. There'll be another video with some more sounds and patches coming in the near future. Cheers for watching. Check out the Grand Terminal video, the Black Noir video and other Endorphin bits linked in the description. Check out the patch and tweak book that I demoed the patch from as well. Support the work I do on patreon.com/DivKid. Hit like, subscribe, all the usual patter. Cheers for watching.